G'day you mob, welcome to this episode of the Goss, where I sit down with my dad and we have a bit of a chinwag, a bit of a yarn, a bit of a chat about the week's news, current affairs, everything in the media. Well, not everything, but quite a few of the stories. So this week we get into this episode and we talk about a little bit about family history, as my dad's writing a family history book at the moment that is obviously about his family's history. We talk about how I ended up being related to the royal family, well, to numerous royal families in Britain, and we talk about why those families were so incestuous with their marriages. Then we talk about the racism, riots, the issues going on in the US at the moment that's kind of spilling over into the rest of the world. And we talk about the media in Australia and the world's most powerful man, arguably. Anyway, without any further ado, guys, kick the kookaburra. Let's get into it. Dad, welcome to this episode of The Goss.
Hey, Pete. Good to see you.
What's going on?
Not a lot, really. I've just been mostly writing family history for the last few weeks.
Have you found that process?
It's been interesting, being a euphemism for all sorts of things. Varies between tedious and really entertaining. The entertaining part is writing the bits about the people that I know about, because I can try and tell their story based on what I know. The tedious parts are the generations before that, where I'm really just doing sort of names, dates, locations, and trying to tie a bit of a story around those, rather than just having, Fred was born on the 7th of October and he died on the 18th of January. And so,
going back into our family history, and I assume our family history is probably a good representative of the average...
certainly the average Anglo-Celtic family.
Anglo-Celtic family,
Working
whether in
class.
Australia or Great Britain. How much information do you actually get the further back you go? Like, when does it really bottleneck?
Well, there's two major sort of watersheds if we're going backwards, particularly in England. England and Scotland, and that was when civil registration started. That is where the government actually recorded births, deaths and marriages, and in England that was 1837 and in Scotland 1855.
Was that the census? Or was that
censuses
else?
Were taken, there were vague censuses taken all the way through the 19th century, but the first proper one was 1841, and then they're every 10 years after that.
And what was the reason for bringing those in?
Well, censuses are really done for mostly just to understand the population, the distribution of population, so that a government can distribute funds appropriately. They need to know how many people are in the country, but they also need to know where they are and what conditions they're living in and what work they have and so on. So they're interesting. And then the watershed before that was when Henry VIII created the Church of England and effectively tossed out most of the Catholic priests and monks from their castles and churches and so on. But once he created the Church of England, in order to be able to tell who was a true Church of Englander and who was not, that is, a Catholic, he created an edict that the church would record baptisms, births, deaths, marriages. And so from the mid-16th century, you've got the church recording those. Before that, the only people who recorded those were the aristocracy, because they were interested in inheritance of money and land, and so they needed to know who was related to whom. And it's fairly incestuous because effectively families are marrying into other families for political, social and financial reasons, and so they needed to know who everybody was. And so it was that was more of a selfish imperative on the behalf of those aristocratic families.
I know that there are a lot of those families. I don't know what it's like in terms of Great Britain history and how incestuous they were in the royal family and other aristocrats trying to maintain bloodlines and connections between different families in order to maintain their wealth and keep away from the riffraff of the lower class. But I know that, is it Cleopatra who's got like a really messed up family tree where I don't know if it was her personally having relations with brothers and then children with them.
I'm not sure about that sort of ancient Egypt time.
I think I remember studying like phylogenetics or something at an evolution at a university, and them showing a family tree at some point of Cleopatra's, and it was like totally just messed up in terms of like there were grandchildren connected to grandparents because they'd married through something, and you know, siblings having children, divorcing, separating, having children with uncles and aunties.
Much more modern than that was Queen Victoria. And she's often called the mother or grandmother of Europe because all of her children married into European royal families. Yeah. And so from there down, from the middle of the 19th century to today, most of the royal families in Europe are related because they all relate back to marriages from Queen Victoria's children.
It is pretty crazy, but I think after watching something like, you know, Game of Thrones, what was the other one? The Last Kingdom. You really do start to understand why marriages were so important across those boundaries in order to shore up alliances. And I mean, it's sort of tragic because obviously women were mostly used as pawns.
Oh, completely. They were just fodder for socio-political gains by their fathers and their husbands.
But it was weird. I found myself watching The Last Kingdom, which is about Alfred in the years of, I think, the 800s, 900s, and his children, his offspring. But you see how screwed up it is. I think in the show, at least, you know, they've sensationalized it. But his son, for example, doesn't want to be a king. Yeah. He's like, fuck this. Like, I don't want this responsibility.
No, exactly.
You know, and he's like, he you know, had children and married a commoner, at least in the show. I don't know how much this reflects reality.
Yeah, I'm not sure of Alfred's children. So
but he was, in the show, he's like forced effectively to divorce this woman. She's taken to the nunnery in order to hide her. The children had taken to nunneries and whatever it is, the monasteries to become monks and to hide them away because other people will kill them in the future if he marries an important woman.
Yes.
Because the king, Alfred, wants him to marry an ally in order to get her family's wealth and army and have that kind of control of, I believe it's Wessex. And so you see the rock and a hard place thing of, he's just like, well, I'm in love with this woman. She's had my children, and I have to divorce her, never see my kids again, and marry some other woman that I don't even know, never even meet until I might meet her once or twice before getting married.
Yeah, divorce didn't exist at that time, but it was effectively divorced it was a political game that the church played, where the church, for whatever reason that they wanted to, could declare a marriage null. So they would annul marriages for political reasons. And they'd do things like saying you can't be married to this person because you're too closely related. Yeah, you might have been fifth or sixth cousins, but for those two people, they would decide that was too closely related, so they nullify the marriage
in our favour.
Exactly. And then not only that, but the father or of the woman or the man himself would have to pay a fine to the church in order to get divorced. We're going to tell you you're not allowed to be married anymore. It wasn't the church making those decisions, but it was effectively the church giving approval for political reasons to annul marriages. So a man could marry another woman that was going to be better socially or financially.
Yeah, but it is so, how else do you manage it? Because it's not just a thing unique to British culture. It seems like women throughout history have just been used as ways of shoring up alliances, keeping the peace, maintaining wealth and strength. And, looking back, based on today's, context, that's incredibly barbaric and unfair and sexist and misogynistic and horrible. But at the time, it's kind of like, well, if you don't play by those rules, the tribe next door or the group next door is just going to come in and take over and do exactly that in order to maintain power.
Exactly.
So it was definitely something crazy watching it. You sort of like, it's not like they really have many other options.
No. And there are certainly, your mother is doing her family history, and she's gone back to medieval times because she is related to royalty. Yeah. And therefore you are too. Yeah. But that means that there are records around of those people. And there are plenty of cases where women have been married 2 or 3 times, they've had 10 children, and then they just go, stuff this, I'm going to go off to the nunnery. They go off and hide themselves away in a nunnery for the rest of their lives. Yeah. Because they just think, I'm not going to be married to some other, I'm not going to be another pawn to be married to some other sort of middle-level aristocrat to shop up, to shore up his finances. So there are a lot of cases where women simply donated all of their estate when they, because they were not entitled to inherit from their husbands when their husbands died. But if they didn't have children, then they could just hive off the estate to the church. Which was one of the reasons that, that the whole thing about Henry VIII bringing in divorce and legalising divorce in order to divorce his wife had nothing to do with it.
It was because he got sick of chopping their heads off, right?
Well, that was that was later, after he divorced his first wife. But really, divorcing his first wife, he could have been done. The church would have granted it if he had pushed hard enough. Really, what he wanted to do was to kick out the Catholic Church from England, and that was a trigger that he could do that.
What was the deal there? So he was married to...
He married his brother's wife. His brother died very young.
Yeah.
And
who was in line for the throne?
Yeah, his older brother. Henry was never going to be the king.
Yeah.
His older brother was, but his brother died very young and effectively left a young widow who was 20 years older than Henry. He was a teenager when they were betrothed.
Yeah.
A teenager being betrothed to a woman in her late 30s. Yeah. So
again, showing that she was effectively being used as a
power. And she was a Spanish princess.
Yeah.
So at the time the political thing was we have to keep an alliance with Spain.
Yeah.
And so just having an ex, a daughter-in-law to the state, if you like, was not the right thing. So they needed him to marry her. And allegedly they got on very well. But in the end...
She had her head chopped off.
Well, no, she didn't. They just divorced.
Okay.
He divorced her.
It was the next ones.
Yeah, it was the next ones that were... a few had their heads removed and a few just got sidelined.
But apparently... So, what was the issue? He was wanting to have a son, obviously, to have an heir, and none of them were giving him sons. And so after a few miscarriages or daughters that were born, he was like, this isn't working.
Yeah. But he ended up with a son.
Yeah.
But that son was ill and he died as a teenager. He became king... but died.
For a short period.
Yeah. And then his older sister Mary was queen.
Yeah.
And that Mary was Catherine of Aragon's daughter. She was the first wife. And then Elizabeth became queen, to whom you are related. It's through the Boleyn family, not through the Tudor kings. But although now it appears you are related to the Tudor kings through another branch. But
well, I guess, as you say, because it's so incestuous once you get in.
Yeah.
The crazy thing with Henry VIII, isn't it, that he had syphilis or some sort of sexually transmitted disease, and that was syphilis. Part of the reason that he was potentially having a lot of miscarriages or not fertile and not having children with his wife. So it was actually him, not his wives. Yeah. Oh, man, germ theory, huh? If only it had been around. So was that the 1500s?
Yeah, that was 1500s. Yeah.
Jesus. News-wise, how have you gone this week? Well, I know you're going to be loving the sports stuff with the canned laughter and all that's back on, right?
I know. It's
how's that going?
I haven't watched the rugby league game. We're fortunately being a Melbourne Storm supporter, and they were apparently terrible the other night. So
they still got cheers.
Yeah, exactly.
So what happened? They've come back. They've been allowed to. Is this countrywide? Like how?
They're playing. The rugby league is now playing. Well, the National Rugby League is playing again. They started off this weekend. The AFL, the Australian Football League, starts in 2 weeks, and they're playing with no crowds. There's a limit, I think, to 50 people. So 25 people, other than the players, 25 people from each club are allowed in the stadium.
Yeah.
And that's probably a quarter of what they would normally have with all the
people on the benches,
people on the all the runners and all that sort of stuff.
Is it weird to watch that? Has it changed the game much aside from obviously the external stuff, the crowds and everything like that? Is the game because you've got fewer refs or fewer
I haven't watched a rugby league game. There's only this round. I haven't watched one of those yet, but it would be different. Certainly with only one referee, they normally have two. It will be slightly different. I suspect that watching the AFL games, the one round that we played in March or early April, that with no crowds, it was bizarre. It was just this echo chamber.
Yeah. It must be pretty weird, right? Especially as the players, you wonder how much it would affect the actual playing because you would not... Obviously, a team's morale. Because I was having this thought the other day, and I wasn't stoned or anything, but I was having this thought. I'm like, my God, ball sports are effectively battles, right? Like it's our mock versions of
that's what they all started from.
Of battles, It's the only way you can do it in where both sides still get injured, but the contest isn't deadly, and it's still entertaining to watch, obviously. But that obviously, just as in a battle, morale on either side is really important. If you see your side's losing, you're likely to be like, well, all right, I'm going to bail.
Yeah.
It's the same with sport, right? And how much of that do you think feeds into having a big crowd behind you cheering?
Yeah, well, that people have spoken about for decades, if not centuries, in sport about the home ground advantage.
Yeah.
Some of which would be the quirkiness of the ground that you are playing on, whatever that might be. But mostly, I think it's having the majority of the crowd on your side.
Wouldn't it also be not having to travel?
Well, there's a bit of that, but even back in the old days, in the VFL, Victorian Football League, it was one team in Geelong and 11 teams in Melbourne. The longest you had to travel was to go from
an hour
Geelong to Moorabbin, which at the time was about an hour on the bus. So that wasn't terribly difficult to get there.
Didn't they use horse and carts back then, Dad?
I'm sure. Well, originally they would have. It would have been interesting with Melbourne and Geelong playing each other in the 1860s and 70s, having to travel down the old Geelong Road, which must have been a very long trip by.
This is the Princess Highway nowadays, right?
Princess Highway,
but it would have been a lot smaller.
Yeah.
So crazy. Has AFL gone back yet?
No, 2 weeks.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then what's the plan in terms of like the grand final? How are they going to? Are they just fast tracking?
Well,
stats.
They're trying to play 17 rounds so that every team plays each other once.
Wow.
And they've run out of time. They know that. So they're pushing the finals out another month.
Okay. So the
that'll
finals
give them
are
another
usually
4 weeks. They're usually in
the end
September.
of September.
So
right?
the grand final is usually the last weekend in September.
Yeah.
And so they're pushing them out a month, but I think they're still going to be a week short. And so I suspect what they're going to do, at the moment they're only playing one game a week, but I suspect once the teams are up and running again, because the biggest risk that the clubs are scared of is if they go straight in, it'll be injury to players.
Yeah.
And it'll be soft tissue injuries, people just tearing muscles and so on.
Because they haven't been maintaining
contact will be
playing.
Probably a little bit worse because they're not used to playing. They haven't been training with contact for 3 months. So I think there'll be a little bit of that, that they'll try and ease into, and then they might go on to a sort of 5-day cycle where you end up playing 3 times in 4 times in 3 weeks, that sort of thing. So
that's going to be so interesting to see what happens in terms of sports and COVID, right? Because you've got the Olympics pushed out, so.
The major tennis tournaments are affected. Wimbledon is just cancelled, and the US Open are making a decision in 2 weeks' time as to whether to run it or not. They're in September. They're the last one in the year.
Yeah.
And the French Open have already pushed out till, I think, October.
Surely tennis isn't a problem, aside from obviously not having the funds from having huge crowds
the
there.
problem is that
2 people on a court or
but the problem is getting them there because it's an international sport in major tournaments. Players have got to come from all over the world to get there, and most countries have still got limited migration in. So it's
what do you think is going to happen with that first getting back into sport from people? Do you think there'll be higher levels of injury? Do you think people are going to be suddenly playing at a lower level because they've been out of practice for a long time?
Yeah, look, I think the first round or two of, certainly in AFL, and that's the game I watch most, in terms of national level competitive sport, the first round or two of AFL every year is never the same skill level or intensity level, and I'm sure that's because the players are still ramping up. Yes, they're very fit because they've had 4 months of out of season training, but that's just fitness training, and then they get into a bit of contact training and so on. But as they always say, there's nothing like match fitness where you have to play a match for 2 hours with the intensity of full body contact. That's different from just running 10Ks a day to try and keep fit. So,
yeah, true. Any other interesting stories in the news that have popped up?
I think the big news in the last 2 days are obviously the riots in the United States.
The last 4 days, right?
That's the first time that, certainly the last 2 or 3 days, that COVID has been bumped from the lead story on radio and television news. Last night's news had the first 15 minutes of a half-hour news was on the riots in the US. And then they suddenly went, and we've got 4 new cases in Victoria of COVID.
Well, the thing that blows my mind, so what happened, to give context to that for anyone who isn't up to date, George Floyd was an African-American man pulled over by the police, I believe, taken out of his car, and I haven't seen all of the footage, but effectively ends up somehow outside of the car, he ends up then on the ground with a policeman kneeling on his neck. And he's saying, I can't breathe, yeah. And then I think he passes out, and when the ambulance comes, he was
dead and they couldn't revive him.
And then obviously we've had this huge backlash from the public in, was it Minnesota where that happened? Missouri?
It was Minnesota, the city of Minneapolis in Minnesota.
Okay. Minneapolis. And so you've had, all these people rioting. There are so many weird things with that, though, that have blown my mind. Like the fact that everyone has sort of forgotten about how bad COVID currently is in the US, and they're in crowds of thousands of people rampaging through the street with their shirts off and everything. Exactly. And there's, people fighting. And the other side of it is just the looting and rioting. So there's people like burning down other people's stores, many of whom are, Indigenous Americans or Asian Americans, African Americans. They had nothing to do with the police, look, and they're not even white, right? If you want to have a racial
look, I think there's two things going on there. One is that most of the protests that we don't see are peaceful. There have been plenty of peaceful protests in the same cities that there are, there's riots going on, and in others. And so there's an element of the population that are simply protesting in a peaceful way against, the treatment, particularly of black men, by police in the United States.
Pause you there. Something really touching the other day that I saw, maybe yesterday, was a group of white American, I think largely white American police officers effectively saying, we're joining you guys and we're here to protect you and make sure you have a voice, and getting in with them and just being like, we'll support you.
And there's lots of politicians doing the same thing. I mean, the mayor of New York has been out in the streets. The mayor of Los Angeles, the same thing. They're actually joining the protests, the peaceful protests. And so there's that side of it. And then there's the opposite end of that, where there's a whole lot of petty criminals who I think are just taking this opportunity of, we can go rioting and looting and smashing things and burning things and so on.
And that feeds into the whole stereotype that they're trying to fight against, right? Because that's the thing that blew my mind when I was watching all these things. I'm like, so how is you smashing a store, taking TVs and guitars, fighting for the rights of black people who are dying in custody, from police? Because it's kind of like you're just furthering the stereotype that black people are criminals by doing that,
exactly,
and justifying.
But, I was talking via text to one of my cousins who lives in just out of Dallas, actually in Fort Worth in the United States,
Texas.
In Texas, and I think there's a proportion of the population now, particularly black American males, who feel like their lives are not valued, because they feel threatened, they feel powerless, they're afraid, and clearly the way they look at it, I'm not saying this is the way they should, but the way they look at it is that society doesn't value their life. So they have nothing to lose. So there's no excuse for rioting and looting and that sort of behaviour. But I think there's an understanding of a reason, and that if as a group of people you have lost all value in your own life, you've got nothing to lose. And that's why I think what's causing a lot of it. But then there are the petty criminals, I think, who are just taking the opportunity of joining in.
Well, and I think you've got groups like Antifa, so the far left, and then you've probably got people that are on the far right getting in there and trying to stir up violence and everything because they want it to become a bigger thing, to be racist or to be...
And this has all happened in a perfect storm, perfect obviously being a descriptor rather than a qualifier, a perfect storm of sociopolitics in the United States over the last 2 to 3 years, and then with COVID over the last 2 to 3 months, in that we have a president in the United States who, from my opinionated point of view, without living in the US, who takes no responsibility for what's happening and has no leadership. The only reaction he's had to this is, well, if you loot, we shoot. So he's effectively giving license to the police and the armed services, because they're calling in the National Guard, to just shoot their own citizens.
Well, and the weird thing is the National Guard, for context, is sort of a military trained...
It's a state militia
that can be brought together to protect the state, but that they're not highly trained soldiers, right?
No, they're not police. It's not their day job.
So they're just brought in to do that. But so can you talk a bit about systemic racism or discrimination in America? Because we see that going on and them talking about that in the media, but how exactly does that manifest itself? I've sort of got my views on it, but do you want to talk about that?
All I can do is go by, yes, you can talk about what you think and what you read, But my personal experience, having visited the United States now, I've lost track of the number of times. I've been there probably 40 times because I used to...
I've been there once.
Yeah.
When I was 12.
Yeah. Well, I worked for a Canadian company and I was there 4 or 5 times a year for 10 years.
Yeah.
And then even before that, travelling there to conferences and so on.
And you've got relatives there?
I've got relatives there and relatives in Canada. There's no easy way to get to Canada via Qantas in Australia, so you go through the United States. And so that the experience that I've had of just being in a whole lot of different cities is that it is highly variable. There are certainly places that, I've been to Los Angeles Airport probably 60 times going in and out of the United States, but I've only actually spent 2 nights in Los Angeles. So I've got very little living experience of what life is like.
G'day, mate. That was the first half of this episode of The Goss. If you would like to continue watching or continue listening to this episode, make sure that you sign up for the premium podcast or academy memberships at aussieenglish.com.au, where you will get full access to these entire episodes of this series and much, much more. You can go check that out using the links below or just go to aussieenglish.com.au. Once again, thank you so much for joining me, mate, and I will see you next time. Peace.